Well, thank you. It is great to be here, and thanks to the Society of Cincinnati for co-sponsoring this event. Boston is what this book is about, and it's where I was born, but I have to admit, I grew up in that maritime center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was in 5th grade at Linden Elementary School that, in retrospect, I read the book that would change my life, Johnny Tremain, by, God bless, Esther Forbes. I mean, this was the book with which I began to realize history is not about dates. It's not about statues in the corners of museums gathering dust. It's about real-life people, ordinary people, like Johnny, like me, anybody, in the midst of extraordinary events. And it's really interesting. I was blessed to have a great AP US history teacher, Miss Wilt. She will always be Miss Wilt. We exchange Christmas cards to this day. And she kept that interest in history alive. But I have to admit, I was an English major in college and grad school. And let's fast forward to 1984. My wife, who has just finished 3 years at Columbia Law School, has her first job as a lawyer in Boston. And so we moved to the North End. We have a 18-month-old daughter, Jenny. And I am at this point, I've worked for a sailing magazine for 4 years and have just finished up a freelance project as editor-in-chief of that illustrious one-time parody of a magazine, Yachting, with 2 A's and no C. Hey, it was the 1980s. But my real job was taking care of Jenny. And quickly, we established a routine by which I would spend afternoons pushing Jenny's stroller through the crooked streets of the North End. And inevitably, we would always make our way up to Copp's Hill burial ground. That is the nodal point. That is where history, that's the vortex, I feel, of history in Boston, where you stand up there and you look out and you see the harbor spread out before you, you see the Charlestown Peninsula and the Bunker Hill Monument, and there are these canted, crooked stones. One of the best ones is Daniel Malcolm, a noted patriot who died just a few years before the revolution would explode in Boston, and during the British occupation. So the story goes, they used the stone is adorned with patriot rhetoric, and the regulars used it for target practice. And you can see the dents and chips created by the musket balls. It's just a great place. And I began to, what was Boston like in the time of Johnny Tremain? And so that fall, every Sunday, I'd take the T to the Boston Public Library, and I began to research the history of Boston. It was really my first foray into history, and with a particular interest in the topographical evolution of Boston. As we all know, Boston in 1775 bore absolutely no resemblance to Boston today. It was a 1.1 square mile island dominated by 3 hills of mountainous proportions. Here we are on Beacon Hill, which is just a shadow of what it once was. They were all shaved down and used for fill. This was when the Back Bay wasn't a neighborhood. It was the Back Bay, water-lapped Boston Common. It was from the edge of Boston Common that the 500 British regulars would set out on the night of April 18th towards Concord. And it was connected by a thin neck of land to Roxbury. On spring high tides, it would actually be washed over, creating a literal island. 15,000 people divided into the north end and the south end, with a stream running through a mill dam. The causeway is where the dam was. And if you walk Washington Street into the financial district, you're following along where that thin neck of land was. And I live on Nantucket Island, have for 28 years, and Nantucket Island has a population pretty close to what Boston was at this time, of 15,000. And I can tell you from experience, when you're living on an island with a group of people of that size, you get to know just about everyone. And in fact, we have testimony from someone from Philadelphia during the Revolution, which had a much larger population, that he knew the name of literally everyone. And you begin to see how personal it was. I grew up thinking of the Revolution as kind of this ideologically driven event based on eloquent speeches in the Continental Congress. And it was just it was a thing of principles rather than of passions and violence. And when I decided to research the book, Bunker Hill, which in many ways is a follow-up to an earlier book of mine, Mayflower, which takes the voyage of the Pilgrims to the second generation, because the children always seem to mess it up. And with this terrible war, King Philip's War, fought almost precisely 100 years before the Revolution, 1675 and 76. And I began to realize with that there was a lot of unfinished business in those Indian wars of the 17th century that would extend into the century to come. When in the midst of King Philip's War, which was just this devastating conflict, a third of the towns in Massachusetts were burned and abandoned. I mean, there was even talk of creating a bridge, a wall around which the white population would defend itself and surrender the rest of the colony to the native population. It was that bad. And in the midst of this, an emissary from the king talked to Governor Leverett about how things are going, and he had the temerity to say that let the king know that if he wants to extend our liberties, that's just fine. And does he know that our general court has sovereignty over us, in fact, over anything Parliament might try to impose upon us? And here he was, 100 years before the Revolution, basically saying exactly what his descendants would be saying in the 18th century. And so with Bunker Hill, I began to realize, this was initially a deeply conservative impulse. It was to keep things the way they had always been, because they had been very good in the colonies in terms of they were the freest, least taxed people in the British Empire. Lord North, Prime Minister of Great Britain, estimated that the average colonist paid 1/50th of the taxes of a Londoner. And yet Great Britain was hobbled by terrible debt, much of it accumulated during the fighting of the French and Indian War 15 years before, fought by and large on New England's behalf, eliminating the threat of the French to the north. And so they felt that the taxes that they tried to impose with the Stamp Act in 1765 and with subsequent measures was not a question of imposing tyranny on the colonies. This was just bringing fiscal responsibility. They were tuning up the empire to become the great force it would be in the 19th century. Their sense of the sovereignty of Parliament was based on principles by which this was a check to the potential overweening powers of the monarch. And so when they talked about sovereignty of Parliament, it was not some tyrannical. It was essential to the English liberties that had allowed New Englanders to flourish so well. And now the New Englanders, of course, had a very different point of view. Many of them were descended from Puritans who had come in the 17th century to escape the reach of the king and his bishops so they could worship as they pleased. They did not come here in search of religious freedom. The Quakers quickly found that out when several of them were hanged here on Boston Common. A sense of religious certitude was built, hardwired into their DNA. A sense of autonomy. We came here to do it on our own, and we have created this society, what John Winthrop called this city on a hill, on our own. No thanks to this island 3,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And, how dare you now, at this belated moment, begin to try to tax us? And once again, there's no talk of independence. This was about, no taxation without representation. They viewed these as newfangled innovations, was the term. They objected to that. They wanted it the way it had been. And so tensions begin to mount. There's the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. But 2 years later, by the fall of 1772, Samuel Adams, who is kind of the Svengali of the Patriot movement, is worried. All of the momentum that they had built is dissipating. This could just blow over. There's a distressing calm and quiet coming to Massachusetts. And it's then that he invents the institution that I think did more than anything to make the revolution ultimately unfold, the 21-member Boston Committee of Correspondence. And this 21-member committee would pen open letters discussing the issues of the day. Does Parliament have sovereignty over us? And then sending these letters out to the more than 250 towns throughout Massachusetts. And now remember, this was when Massachusetts included modern Maine. Now, on Nantucket, we still have that beloved institution of the town meeting. And I can tell you from experience, this is a democracy at its combative best, where well-known personalities in the community come to the fore, issues are discussed and, belittled, championed, until finally a decision is arrived. This is democracy. Consensus comes. But up until this point, it was a purely local institution, talking about, bridge repair and widening roads, those kinds of things. With the invention of the Boston Committee of Correspondence and those letters, suddenly these became forums in which these letters were read and the political issues of the day were discussed. Samuel Adams had created an autonomous network of communication outside of the royal realm, outside of the control of that. He was turning these town meetings into the 18th century equivalent of chat rooms. And they began to get letters back. By January of 1773, from the town of Gorham, now Maine, just about 5-10 miles inland from West Portland. This was a town founded by the descendants of King Philip War veterans. It had been attacked by native peoples 15 years before, several townspeople killed, several abducted. And in their letter to the Boston Committee of Correspondence, they say, we are humble farmers. We cannot pretend to understand the subtleties involved with Parliament and all of these discussions. But we do know what it is to fight, to defend our way of life. Our houses are still stained with the blood of those who died defending our liberties. Our swords are still sharpened. Our women still know how to make the cartridges that go into the muskets that we carry with us each day when we farm. And if we must fight once again to defend those liberties, we will fight. And what Samuel Adams and the others in Boston began to realize is the real radicals weren't in Boston. They were out there in those 250 what were known as country towns. And these guys, because of the more than century-old tradition of the town militia, were armed. And then many of them were experienced officers in the wars that came up to this. They were transferring everything that had, all those Indian wars were now being all of that was now being transformed to the new enemy, not to the north, but to the east on the other side of the Atlantic. And if it ever came to war, Samuel Adams knew where his army would come from.